Hey everyone, I hope that you're well. Today I'm going to be doing my Victober/October wrap-up. So for this video I'm going to talk about my Victober books first, and then I'm going to talk about some of the other books that I read in October. The first book I want to talk about is Middlemarch by George Eliot. This was my first Victober read, and I only read 2 books for Victober, so I kind of failed there, but I'm so glad that I read this. It was amazing. So this novel is set in Middlemarch, the fictional town that is acting as a microcosm for the rest of England during the time of the land reform, so around 1832. Because this novel is acting like a community portrait of a town that's representing a wider nation, there is a lot of different concerns and ideas in this book. We have things like, obviously, the land reform. We have discussions around religion, medical practice or medical malpractice. We have discussions about marriage, expectations within marriage, gender relations, all sorts of things, technological progression in the form of railroads. This novel has a large breadth of intellectual discussion, and it's one of the reasons why I loved it so much. But beyond that, George Eliot's a phenomenal writer, and her writing style instantly hooked me in. At the outset, it does kind of look a little bit impenetrable, a little bit cold, but it is such a rich and sharp and observant kind of writing that just left me in awe. And it's also quite humorous as well. There's some actually quite funny parts in this novel, of course very sarcastic, but nonetheless, it kind of did break that image that I had of George Eliot as this kind of stuffy writer, or at least how a lot of other people talk about her. So I was pleasantly surprised in that regard. But another thing is the characterization. I thought that all the characters in here were so wonderfully developed, but in particular Dorothea, who I think is perhaps my favourite character in all of Victorian literature. Now, I haven't read a huge amount of Victorian literature, but she is definitely my favourite. And I think it's because she's so complex. She is at once pious and withdrawn and lofty and warm and expansive and approachable. You get to see so many different sides to her throughout the novel, and it's interesting because she does seem like she's going to be the main character, and then she recedes into the background, and then she comes back and then recedes and comes back, and I liked that because I felt that was George Eliot kind of saying to us that, you know, this is how human relationships work. There's an ebb and a flow, there's a rhythm to human relationships on a micro level, but also on a macro level. And that was just something that I picked up on. I felt that George Eliot might have been attempting to do that through the way that the characters kind of weave in and out of the story. Beyond Dorothea, Fred Vincy is so endearing, and there's Rosamond, who is petulant, and yet you still sympathise with her and her struggles in her marriage with Lydgate. And of course there's Lydgate himself, who I found to be an honourable man and someone whose ideas I resonated with. I just feel like I'm not doing this book justice with this review, but I wanted to leave off on saying that the final paragraph of this book is one of my favourite final paragraphs in all of literature that I have thus far read. I just think it's just wonderful, and it so beautifully encapsulates what this novel really is about, which is about the small efforts of humanity that combine and converge into the greater picture, which is the progress of our species. And I will read it, actually, because I just think it's wonderful. Her finely touched spirit had still its fine issues, though they were not widely visible. Her full nature, like that river of which Cyrus broke the strength, spent itself in channels which had no great name on the earth. But the effect of her being on those around her was incalculably diffusive, for the growing good of the world is partly dependent on unhistoric acts, and that things are not so ill with you and me as they might have been, is half owing to the number who lived faithfully a hidden life and rest in unvisited tombs. The other book that I read for Victober is Villette by Charlotte Brontë, and I was not nearly as impressed with this one. In fact, there were times when I was reading this that I thought to myself, I want to put this book down. And that was a real shame for me because it was one that I had been anticipating greatly as I approached Victober. This book has been lauded as Charlotte Bronte's most mature work, and I'm always interested in those kinds of comments, because the same was said about Persuasion by Jane Austen, and I found that book to be brilliant, much better than Sense and Sensibility, for instance, which I read this year and was a little disappointed by. Villette, however, disappointed me in different ways. But let's not focus too much on that. I want to talk about Lucy Snowe, because Lucy Snowe was easily the highlight of this book. And she's one of those characters that will stick in my mind always, and she's very memorable. But she's memorable because she is so distanced and reserved and passive in the face of all these things happening around her. But it's not without reason, and I think that Charlotte Brontë really explores these ideas of mental illness and feeling consigned to a life of disappointment, expecting the worst so that you're not left devastated when you expect something positive and it doesn't happen. All of these things are very relevant today, and I think this is one of the reasons why Villette speaks to people, and in that regard it did speak to me as well. I love the disdain that Lucy has for the reader, especially come the end of the novel, where she kind of just says, I could tell you what actually happens, but I'm going to let you ruminate on that and I'll bid you goodbye. And the novel kind of ends with that. But I think this is very clever on Charlotte Bronte's part, because Lucy is a character who, even before this, before you know that she really doesn't want the reader to know things, you know that as a character, she is holding something back, always. But I find that one of the more compelling things about this novel, Lucy Snowe as a character, and how the absences and the silences in the things that she says or doesn't say are just as meaningful as the things that she does say. And I think it's a triumph of Charlotte Brontë to write a character so well as this. In saying that, I don't really feel like the rest of the novel held up for me. There were sections where I felt it was a little boring. In fact, there was a chunk in the middle where every time I tried to read it, I would fall asleep, which is never a good sign. I also didn't really buy Lucy's relationship with the English professor. I felt that come the end of the novel, what actually happened with them was a little bit unrealistic, and I don't know, I feel like there are other people who feel the same way about that, surely. I think what did save this novel for me was Lucy Snowe as a character and Charlotte Bronte's writing, which was often wonderful. It was brilliant. It, much like George Eliot, was witty, was insightful, was sharp. Sometimes she did tend to verbosity a little bit, and it left me feeling a bit impatient, but it didn't happen too often for it to be a negative thing. Overall, I felt quite mixed on this book, and I think I ended up giving it a 3 to 3.5 out of 5, so it wasn't terrible, but I was expecting more from it. Next, we've got some rapid-fire reviews. So the first one I want to talk about is Joe Shapcott of Mutability. This is a poetry collection that I think in 2010 won the Costa Award for Best Poetry Collection. I picked this up on a whim from a Remainder bookstore. This cost me $3, so I thought, what have I got to lose? This poetry collection is, as the title suggests, about change. And it's about change in nature, change in human relationships, change in the human body. And I think that these themes are explored really well here. It was interesting because this is the first poetry collection where I've seen active integration of scientific jargon, for instance, gut epithelium, which was pleasing to see, but also a little jarring at times. I felt that it was implemented to varying success. Some poems in here are concerned with Joe Shapcott's battle with breast cancer, so she talks a lot about changes in her cells, which I thought was quite interesting. I studied biomedical science at university, so this was right up my alley. But there was a movement in this collection about trees that I didn't feel was as impactful or as insightful as other poems here. Some highlights from here were Abishag, Scorpion, La Serenissima, and I Go Into the Tree. There were more that I could talk about if I did a full review, but I might leave it there. Overall, I enjoyed this collection. I do recommend that you check it out if you are interested in poetry that takes a bit of a different tack, especially when it comes to talking about biology and science. If it were not for the tree movement, I would give this a 4-star rating, but I've ended up giving it a 3.5 out of 5. The next poetry collection is The Curiosities by Christopher Reid. I like Christopher Reid. I read Nonsense, which is another collection by him last year. I really enjoyed it. This one, not so much. This poetry collection is built around the idea of the letter C, and every poem title in this collection is a noun beginning with the letter C. Not much to it beyond that. This is a bit of a mixed bag. Naturally, if you're operating within the confines of such a conceit, it's going to be difficult to come up with something engaging and new every single time. So I felt that some poems kind of felt like cul-de-sacs. They didn't really go anywhere. They were of little consequence. But some, like the Calabash and the Cyborgs, were really quite insightful, quite witty. And I think that's what Christopher Reid does the best, when he's has something to say about human relationships or society at large. So bit of a mixed bag for me. I ended up giving this 3 stars. The next poetry collection I want to talk about is Human Chain by Seamus Heaney. And I'm going to keep my thoughts really brief on this because I actually don't feel confident enough to talk about this in any particular depth at all. I definitely need to reread this one. This is my first Seamus Heaney and I absolutely loved it. This collection is all about human relationships, the way that humans are connected with one another. It's funny, I thought this title sounded a bit ominous, but no, it's really just about human relationships. And I have a special connection with this one because Seamus Heaney is Northern Irish, and so am I. I've lived in Australia for 11 years, but I grew up in Northern Ireland, and all my family's Northern Irish. So whenever he mentioned places like Derry and Magherafelt, I felt like there was some kinship there. My favorite poem in here was the title poem, Human Chain, which was a fascinating and very clever poem about the inevitability of death. I will have probably a video about Seamus Heaney in the future. I really want to read all of his works. So you probably will see Human Chain come back into the picture, and I will have analysis and all that good stuff happening. But for now, I just didn't get time to revisit this and read the poems more carefully and more closely. So that's why I don't have much to say about this. But I really enjoyed this. I highly recommend checking this one out. The next poetry collection and final poetry collection, don't worry, that I want to talk about is Philip Larkin's collected poems. I loved this. I'd never read Philip Larkin before, and he is probably my favorite poet at the moment. The poetry collection comprises his 4 published collections, The North Ship, The Less Deceived, The Whitsun Weddings, and High Windows. I didn't love The North Ship. The North Ship was an early collection of Philip Larkin's that I think even he felt a little embarrassed about because it was mainly imitative. Specifically, he was imitating W.B. Yeats, who is a poet that I don't really like. So naturally, I wasn't going to feel much love towards this. But the title poem, The North Ship, was fantastic. And it was kind of emblematic of the quality of the poems that would follow in his other 3 collections. I wrote a review of this on Goodreads. It's not particularly long, but I think it describes my feelings on the poetry that I read in a much more succinct and accurate fashion than I could achieve in this video. So I will leave a link to that below. But yeah, I think I rated it 4.5 out of 5. It was fantastic. Okay, so now I have 2 more books to talk about. I want to talk about this one, Thomas Midnight Garden by Phillipa Pearce. This was a childhood favorite of mine, and I forgot about it for the longest time. I remembered the storyline. I remembered a lot of the images that I had when I was a child, but I completely forgot the name of it until recently. It suddenly just came to me one morning. I woke up and I thought, Tom's Midnight Garden, that's it. So I ended up getting it from the library, and it's as good as it was when I was a child. It's actually better. I would say I enjoyed this more because I definitely got a lot more out of it as an adult. It's still just as whimsical and enchanting as it was all those years ago. It's about a boy who has to go and live with his aunt and uncle after his brother contracts measles, and he initially hates the place. He had this dream of spending the summer with his brother out in their garden. They were going to build a tree house and have all sorts of adventures, and now he can't. He's living in a flat with his aunt and uncle, there's no garden. Everything's rather glum. However, there is a grandfather clock in the hall of the apartment complex that's owned by an old lady who lives up at the top of the building. One night when Tom is lying in bed, the clock down the stairs starts to chime, but it chimes 13 times when it reaches 1 o'clock in the morning. And Tom gets up to investigate this. And what he finds is that the hallway has completely transformed and that there is now a huge back garden. And Tom starts to explore this back garden, and he starts to get to know the inhabitants of that garden and the people who lived in the flat building long ago. And it's so wonderful. It's really enchanting. And there's one scene in particular where he has a friend called Harriet, and Harriet lives in the house in this kind of alternate reality. And they have this argument, this really cyclical argument about who is a ghost and who isn't. And Tom says, well, you have to be a ghost because you passed through me. And she said, no, you're a ghost because I passed through you. And it's just this humorous little exchange that stuck with me from when I was a kid, and reading it again, it's just as entertaining. So I really recommend that you read this if you haven't. It's fantastic, despite the fact that it is written in a bit of an old-timey fashion. It's still really readable now, and I think that people can still get a lot out of this, even if they're an adult. So yeah, I really recommend this one. And the final book I want to talk about is The Nickel Boys by Colson Whitehead. I was really excited to read this book. It's received a lot of praise on Goodreads and on BookTube. The novel follows a boy called Elwood Curtis who has been abandoned by his parents and lives with his grandmother in Tallahassee, Florida. And he is a very intelligent young boy. He is studious. He is committed to anything that he puts his mind to. And this is set against the backdrop of the civil rights movement. Elwood is really taken by Martin Luther King Jr.'s speeches. And it's kind of this code that he lives by. And it's a dream of Elwood's to go to study at college. However, this dream gets cut short after a mistake he makes that results in him being sent to a correction school for delinquent teenagers. This novel is concerned with what happens to Elwood at this school and also the other boys that he meets. And I can tell you a lot of harrowing things happen to Elwood and other characters in this novel. Unfortunately, this is actually based on a true story, and I think the fact that it was based in reality makes this book all the more impactful. I think that it explores important themes. These things need to be discussed, and I think that there need to be more novels like this that approach these themes in the way that this novel did. But unfortunately, I didn't really feel like it was a successful novel for me. I felt that Colson Whitehead's writing here was distant, a bit bland. It did create this disconnect between the book and the reader emotionally. At least for me, anyway. I felt it hard to emotionally connect with a lot of the characters in this book, despite the terrible things that were happening to them. This book is very clever, though, and there is a twist at the end that I think a lot of readers will be caught off guard by. I certainly was, but I don't think it had the emotional impact that it was intended to have, and that's just because, again, the writing for me just felt so lifeless. And I also didn't really connect with the characters very much at all, which surprised me. I was not expecting that to happen. Overall, I did feel a bit disappointed with this one, but I can see why so many people love it, and I think it is an important book, so I'm not going to say don't read the book. In fact, I will encourage you to read it. I just don't think that it was the book for me. So that's it for the wrap-up. I apologize, it's probably a very long video. I am in the thick of non-fiction November. I'm really enjoying it. I'm currently working through Thomas Cromwell, A Life by Dermot McCulloch. I'll hopefully finish that in the next few days. And I plan on making a few videos for non-fiction November just so my wrap-up at the end of November isn't really unwieldy and long. So look forward to that, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.